I'm with David Pileggi from Christ Church here in Jerusalem's Jaffa Gate. Now, David, you have a Heritage Centre here. When was the Heritage Centre started?
The idea for the Heritage Center started in the middle 80s, and I think by 1993, 94, it actually began to receive folks, tourists and Israelis. This Heritage Center, of course, maybe many of your listeners certainly may well know, the Heritage Center is somewhat unique in that it highlights the Christian contribution, especially evangelical Christian contribution, to the development of Jerusalem and the Holy Land.
And what sort of things do you have in the Heritage Center?
Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, we have a Heritage Center and a library. Library is full of old photos from the 19th century, glass slides taken by Christchurch photographers. We have manuscripts and journals of the earliest Protestants who lived here. We have records of the hospital, schools, house of industry. All of these institutions were built to help local people and to glorify the name of Jesus in this place. And in the Heritage Center, we have a number of models built in the 19th century. Some of those models were actually built here at Christ Church at our vocational school. We have photos and objects from different periods, beginning in the 1830s and going all the way up to the present. These objects are of interest, again, to Christian pilgrims, and at the same time they are of interest to local Israelis and Arabs as well sometimes.
Did it take a long time to put all this stuff and collate all this stuff together?
Oh my goodness. We have been collecting material from around the world, and this has been the biggest challenge, to organize the material, to record the material, then to photograph it. And this process is still taking quite a bit of our time. So for example, we probably have 5,000 or 6,000 glass slides. Many of them are rare. They're of the Holy Land in the 19th century, as well as we have glass slides from places like Poland and Romania, Ukraine, Morocco, Tunisia, and these glass slides show Jewish life and Christian presence and these Protestant Christian presence in these countries. Well, scanning these slides and recording them properly and organizing them properly is a huge undertaking, and we haven't done it yet because we need the right staff and the right finances in order to finish this project. So we have many, many resources and many challenges ahead of us.
Do many people come to you and ask, do you know anything about my relatives that were here in the past?
Oh, absolutely. We inundated with inquiries from people, especially from the UK. People will write and say, my grandmother attended church here at Christ Church. My grandfather or my mother was at your school. We had a relative who was baptized, married. Can you please send us information? And these are not only people from the UK, but we have people from Europe and even Israel. And sometimes the letters they're so moving because people don't know much about their family history, and they're desperate to know, especially those who were orphans or those who were adopted. And so we do our best with a very, very limited staff to try to provide information. But again, we have so much that has yet to be cataloged and properly computerized that it's certainly sometimes hard for us to help people who are quite desperate.
Does the Holy Land have a rich history of Christians here in the land?
Well, it covers the history of Protestant Christianity, and it covers the beginning of what we might call Messianic Judaism. In the middle 19th century, this was known as Hebrew Christianity. But the Messianic Jewish movement pretty much started at Christ Church. There was an active congregation of Jewish believers in Jesus, and we have resources and archival material that document their community life, and in some cases, lives of key individuals of that community. As I mentioned previously, we have records of the first modern hospital. It was a Protestant missionary hospital, schools, farms, vocational schools. We had the first systematic education school for girls in the Middle East and probably in the entire history of the Middle East. So we think we made a very significant contribution to the development of Jerusalem, to the development of the Holy Land, land of Israel, and we're proud of that history, and we want folks to know about it. We want it to be a good witness or a good testimony to the really incredible work that people did in the past.
Now, you're not just one heritage centre, you're 4 heritage centres. Where are the other centres based?
Well, we have a heritage center at the Anglican School, which was one time the English Mission Hospital. We have a heritage center at our property in Jaffa, which was known as the Park Hotel. This hotel was at one time owned by the Ustinov family, which produced the famous British actor Peter Ustinov. That center in Jaffa was a girls' school and had many other phases to its history, and it also was a center of Messianic Judaism when Jews weren't known as Messianic Jews. So it attracts the interest of a lot of different Israeli groups in the area around Tel Aviv. They often come and hear a talk or hear a lecture or see some of our glass slides, and we are not engaged exactly in what you might call an evangelism, but certainly we're trying to correct the misconceptions and you might say the fake news that so many local people have about Jesus or have about Christians in general. Just as there's a lot of anti-Semitism here in Israel, there's a lot of, you might say, ignorance about Christianity, fear of Christians, maybe fear of outsiders, numerous misconceptions and misunderstandings, and it makes it hard to build relationships between communities when on one side there's anti-Semitism and on the other side there are all these myths, you might say, about Jesus or his followers. So that's our center in Jaffa. We do have a bit of a heritage center at our place in Migdal, which is north of Tiberias.
How welcomed was CMJ in the early days in the Holy Land?
CMJ was very mixed, and I think it went very ambiguous. On one hand, when CMJ came here, it was quite a threat. And this threat, you might say, stirred up the status quo here in the Holy Land. You might say that there was a certain ghettoization in the Middle East at that time, and this ghettoization stopped minorities especially, or kept religious life here from being very dynamic. So if you were born a Jew, you were expected to stay, you might say, in your little box, in your little community until you died. If you're born a Greek Catholic Christian, you were expected to remain, in the Greek Catholic community until you died. Really, the only way you could move was to move from being Jewish or being a Christian to virtually being a Muslim. And so CMJ came to what was then called Turkish Palestine in the 1820s and the 1830s, and it brought this sort of radical new message. And this radical new message said, everybody can be a follower of Jesus. Get out of your box. Stop being ghettoized or imprisoned by, this communal history and an overlay of Islamic intolerance. And so that really put the cat amongst the pigeons. And all of a sudden, Roman Catholics began to fear that their community might convert to Anglicanism, or the Greek Orthodox the same. And Jews were also quite worried. And what it did was to provoke all of these communities to say, oh my goodness, we have neglected our co-religionists in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is an economic and a disaster. It's a very poor town with only sickly and dying, people. We need to go and to counter what CMJ is doing, what the Anglican Church is doing. We need to build hospitals for our communities. We need to build schools for our communities. So CMJ really kind of stirred things up. And the Jewish community or the different Christian communities or the different Muslim communities, they would always find lots of reasons to complain about this. But when they needed our services or they needed our schools or they needed our pharmacies, then they would always find a reason to put those complaints away for a little while. So basically, CMJ wasn't very popular until the local population, Jewish and otherwise, needed us. Maybe they needed our outside political support, or again, they wanted our educational services or our nurses training program, whatever service was on offer.
Why is it important to keep this heritage for the next generation?
Well, I think that it's, again, as I said, for many Jews, Muslims, and even local Christians, there's often you might say, a misunderstanding of who we are and what we did. And I hope that local people, especially as well as Christians coming from the outside, would be able to acknowledge the contribution, that really a significant contribution that was made here. And it's not about praising CMJ or saying how wonderful we are. Folks, for example, from England, doctors, teachers, nurses, and more, they didn't really come out here to serve CMJ. They came out here to serve the Lord. They came out here because God led them, or in some cases, probably even propelled them to come out against their wishes in order to serve the local people, in order to express the love of God to local people in very practical ways. And so I think at the end of the day, it is about our witness. We're certainly, as an organization and as a Christian community, we haven't been perfect. We've made lots of mistakes. We've sent out a number of folks who were, you might say, a bit broken and weren't always the best representatives. But certainly on the whole, yes, I think the historical record speaks for itself. And I believe if anyone examines that historical record, they'll see that there were Christians who loved the Jewish people, loved Arab Christians, loved Muslims, and looked for ways to be of service and to be of a witness. And so I think at the end of the day, it's about the gospel. It's about the God of Israel and his son, Jesus the Messiah.
So we've looked at the history. What's your prayer for the future?
My prayer for the future is that we can get this library better organized, that folks who might be sitting on letters or papers or photos, of the Holy Land, especially in the middle of the 19th century or even the middle of the 20th century, would be willing to donate, and that we can become more and more really a part of the, you might say, the Jerusalem scene. More and more local people will come and visit along with Christian tourists. And I hope that in some way, yes, that when folks come through, that God will be glorified in whatever way that people can perhaps understand that or to receive that.
Okay, David, thank you much.
Thank you for your giving us a few minutes of fame here.